Okay, so buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into some pretty deep waters. We're talking about the billionaire
Yeah,
tax.
the billionaire
This
tax.
has been making waves, especially with the 2024 election right around the corner.
Yeah.
And it's complicated. We're talking about a potential major shift in the U.S. tax code, specifically how we tax the wealthiest Americans.
Right, right.
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got a stack of articles from experts. We've got tax notes, Fortune magazine. We even got a policy paper straight from the White House.
Oh, yeah.
So no matter who you plan to vote for, this is one of those kitchen table issues that could have ripple effects across the entire economy.
It really is. Yeah, and it gets to the heart of how wealth is taxed,
Mm.
and the role of government in addressing wealth inequality.
It's a big one because right now you only pay taxes on your capital gains when you sell an asset. So like if you have a stock or a piece of real estate,
Right.
it's that whole buy low, sell high, and pay taxes later.
Exactly. That's the way it's always been in the U.S.
Right.
But this new proposal, it kind of throws that out the window.
Hmm.
It says, let's tax those gains, but before you sell.
So like if my stock portfolio goes up by $1 million this year, but I don't sell anything, I still have to pay taxes on that $1 million.
That's the idea. Essentially, they're saying, okay, you're richer by $1 million, so you should pay taxes on that increase, even if it's, just on paper for now.
Okay. I see where this is headed, and I have to admit, this already sounds complicated.
Oh, it is. And to be fair to the folks who crafted this proposal, they knew it would be. They've built in a lot of caveats and exceptions, but it still boils down to a massive change in how we tax wealth.
And this isn't just about people with billions.
Right, exactly. They call it the billionaire tax.
Mm.
But the proposal actually sets the threshold at $100 million in net worth.
Oh.
So it's going to impact a lot more people than just, Bezos and Musk.
Yeah, a lot more people. And to make sure those folks actually pay their fair share, there's also a minimum tax component built into this whole thing, right?
Yeah, you got it. The idea is to ensure that everyone above that $100 million mark pays a minimum effective tax rate of 25%, even if most of their wealth is tied up in these unrealized gains.
Okay, so tax and unrealized gains, that's a pretty radical idea. But I can see how, at least in theory, it would make the tax code fairer. But how on earth do you put a price tag on something that hasn't actually been sold yet?
Right.
I mean, are we talking about like sending out government appraisers to like assess everyone's art collection and stock options every year?
Well, that's the $1 million question, or should I say the $100 million question. And it really gets to the heart of one of the biggest criticisms of this proposal, the sheer complexity of actually implementing it.
Yeah, because, I mean, valuing something like a publicly traded stock, that seems relatively straightforward. You look up the ticker symbol, bam, there's your number. But what about things that aren't traded on the open market, like a privately held business or a piece of real estate?
Exactly. The proposal draws a distinction between what it calls tradable and non-tradable assets. So tradable assets, as you said, fairly easy to value because they have a readily available market price. But non-tradable assets, that's where things get messy.
So how do they plan to handle that? Are we going back to like the days of relying on property taxes to like get a sense of what a house is worth?
Well, the proposal suggests using a variety of methods depending on the asset.
Yeah.
So for things like real estate, they might look at recent appraisals or sales of comparable properties. For private businesses, it could get even more complicated, potentially involving things like discounted cash flow analysis or comparisons to similar publicly traded companies.
Okay, but I mean, even then, those are still just estimates, right?
Precisely. And that opens up a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
In terms of potential disputes between taxpayers and the IRS, imagine trying to convince the IRS that your vintage comic book collection is worth less than they think it is.
Oh, man. And let's not forget the IRS is already stretched thin as it is. I mean, are we really going to ask the same folks who are dealing with, like, backlogs and outdated technology to become, like, expert art appraisers overnight?
That's a valid concern. And the Biden administration has acknowledged the need for, significant investment in the IRS. If this proposal were to become law, they've requested a massive budget increase to beef up enforcement and modernize their system.
Well, they're going to need every penny of that and then some. But hold on, there's another wrinkle here that I found fascinating, and it has to do with this idea of illiquid taxpayers. What is that all about?
Ah, yes, the illiquidity loophole. It's a great example of how this seemingly simple idea of taxing unrealized gains gets really complicated really fast.
So break it down for me. What does it mean to be illiquid in this context?
Okay, so imagine you're the founder of a successful startup. On paper, you might be worth, hundreds of billions of dollars because you own a big chunk of a company that's, going like crazy. But here's the catch. You haven't actually sold any of your shares, so you don't have a ton of cash just, lying around.
Okay, so you're rich on paper, but you might not have the cash flow to pay taxes on those unrealized gains. So what's the solution?
Well, the proposal includes a special carve-out for these illiquid taxpayers. Essentially, it would allow them to defer paying taxes on those unrealized gains until they actually sell their assets
Hmm.
and have the cash on hand.
Okay, that makes sense. But I have to imagine there's a catch.
You're
Right.
catching on. The catch is that when they eventually do sell those assets, they could get hit with a hefty deferral charge on top of their regular capital gains taxes. It's kind of like an interest penalty for delaying the inevitable.
So it's a bit of a ticking time bomb.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And it just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing. Because determining who qualifies for this, illiquid status is going to be a judgment call, potentially leading to even more disputes and headaches for both taxpayers and the IRS.
It seems like the more we dig into this, the more complicated it gets. And we haven't even touched on the potential impact on the economy as a whole.
You're right. There's a whole other side to this coin, with economists fiercely debating the potential benefits and drawbacks of, well, such a dramatic change to the tax code.
So we've talked about the mechanics of this unrealized gains tax. And let's be honest, it's a bit of a head spinner. But before we get too lost in the weeds of, valuations and loopholes and all that, I'm curious to hear more about the why behind this whole thing. What are the arguments for and against such a major change to the tax code?
Well, the proponents of this proposal, including the Biden administration, they argue that it's primarily about fairness. They point out that under the current system, the ultra-wealthy can accumulate massive fortunes without paying a dime in taxes until they decide to cash out. Meanwhile, most working-class folks, they're paying taxes on their income throughout their careers.
So it's kind of like a giant loophole for the super rich.
That's one way to look at it. And the White House has been pretty vocal about using this proposal to address, well, the growing wealth gap in America. They argue that taxing unrealized gains would not only generate significant revenue, but also help level the playing field.
Yeah.
Between the haves and the have-nots.
And they've even suggested using that revenue to fund things like education and infrastructure and clean energy initiatives.
Exactly. The argument is that this isn't just about taking from the rich. It's about investing in programs that benefit everyone and, create a more equitable society.
Okay, so compelling arguments in favor of the proposal. But I know there are plenty of critics who see things quite differently. What are their main concerns?
One of the biggest concerns is that taxing unrealized gains could stifle investment and innovation. The argument is that if investors know that they'll be taxed on gains every year, regardless of whether they've actually sold their assets, they'll be less likely to take risks on long-term investments.
So instead of putting money into startups or funding new technologies, they might just park their cash in more conservative investments to avoid the tax man.
Exactly. And that could have a ripple effect throughout the economy, potentially leading to slower growth and fewer opportunities for everyone. Critics also worry about the practical challenges of implementing such a complex system, especially given the already strained resources of the IRS.
Right. We've talked about the administrative nightmare of valuing illiquid assets and the potential for disputes between taxpayers and the IRS.
And then there's the issue of capital flight. If the U.S. becomes the only country with a wealth tax on unrealized gains, some wealthy individuals and corporations might be tempted to, move their assets or even their residency to countries with more favorable tax laws.
Which would obviously be a blow to the U.S. economy.
Exactly. So, as you can see, there are strong arguments on both sides of this debate. It really comes down to your view of the role of government in regulating wealth and promoting economic growth.
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers. So for our listeners who've been patiently following along with us today, what's the key takeaway from all of this? What should they be thinking about as we head into this pivotal election year?
All right. I think the most important thing is to remember that this debate is about more than just taxes. It's about fundamental questions of fairness, economic opportunity, and the role of government in society. It's about grappling with the challenges of wealth inequality
Hmm.
and finding ways to create a more just and equitable world.
And it's a conversation that's not going away anytime soon.
Absolutely not. The outcome of the 2024 election will likely have a significant impact on the future of tax policy in the U.S. So it's crucial for everyone to stay informed, engage in thoughtful dialogue, and make their voices heard on this critical issue.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. For those of you who want to learn even more about this topic, check out the show notes. We've included links to all the articles and reports that we talked about today. Until next time.